I think one of the things that is an adjustment when unionization happens in your workplace is that suddenly you go from being, I think in most cases, a full staff that has a few leadership segments to it, to a staff that has a demarcation line, or down the middle of it.
Well, welcome to Exude Human Capital Consulting's Hold On, Let Me Close My Door, the podcast that brings real stories from real professionals with real solutions to you. Join us as we navigate the ever-changing workplace with Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner of Exude Human Capital, and special guest. Welcome to Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. I'm Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner of Exude Human Capital, and really excited to have a conversation today with Melissa Weiler Gerber, who is the founder and principal of Collective Promise. Welcome, Melissa.
Thanks so much for having me, Allison.
Melissa, you and I have known each other for a long time, and you have a very long, interesting professional history in the legal space and in the not-for-profit space. And in just a moment, I'll have you share a bit about that with our audience. But to frame today's conversation, I wanted to share with our listeners the fact that over the last several years, and this may be no surprise to many of you listening, we have seen a trend in unionization in our nonprofit community, which is a little bit different than we had seen historically. Historically, we saw more unionization in areas like manufacturing and other for-profit sectors. But when we started to see this trend in the non-for-profit sector, it occurred to us that individuals who may be leading nonprofit organizations may not have had the same experiences in going through that transition from a non-union organization to a union organization. So we thought it would be very helpful to hear from someone who went through that process and to share some lessons learned and to prepare leaders to effectively navigate through that change. So with that, Melissa, do you want to share a bit about your background and your experience in this space?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Allison. So, as you mentioned, I am a former big firm attorney. I used to practice in healthcare, insurance, and heavily regulated spaces. I got a lot of experience there, did as much pro bono work as I could possibly get away with, paid
Mhm.
off my student loans, and then started working in the social justice space. And was first the senior staff attorney at the Homeless Advocacy Project in Philadelphia, then moved on to be executive director of Women's Way for a little over a decade. And after that, moved into the role that I was in most recently, which was serving as the president and CEO of Access Matters, which is an organization that's public health focused in the area of sexual and reproductive health access. And coming into that space, I followed a leader who had been there for over 30 years. So I know a little bit about major leadership transitions and really led the organization through rebranding and strategic planning and through some significant both political and financial crises and really working through a trauma informed leadership framework at the organization. And I just wrapped up my 14-year tenure there. And as you mentioned, a lot of the last period of my time there was really leading our management team through unionization to our first collective bargaining agreement, which we ratified just about a year ago today. And so I really wanted to build on my experiences as I left that position to really help other organizations with these kinds of transformative opportunities where things can either go really well or really poorly, depending on your mindset and how they're handled. Things like staff unionization, leadership transitions, and things of that sort. And so I founded Collective Promise for that reason. And I'm really excited to talk with you today about my experiences.
Well, I'm even more excited now hearing I knew much of your background, but then hearing you lay it out in that context, I'm even more excited about our conversation. So you spoke a little bit about your experience working through the unionization at your last nonprofit organization. Can you share with us a bit about what you found most surprising and or challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when it happens, it doesn't matter what your background is. I mean, I was an attorney, by training, but I didn't practice labor law. And so I think when something like this comes upon you, you realize you've got an entire new knowledge base and framework that you have to learn and learn quickly. And so I think there is just a lot of things that you need to do to get your organization up to speed. And I think a big piece that we needed to realize fairly quickly is that we also needed to do a lot of education and translation about our own work to the folks we were going to be negotiating with. So our organization was unionized by the News Guild, which is an entity that is traditionally unionizing and organizing in newspaper settings. So the
Interesting.
revenue stream was entirely different, right? There, it's an unrestricted ad revenue stream. And in an organization like the one I was leading, we were 99% government funded with grants that had very, very restrictive terms around them. So it was a very, very different model. And I think coupled with that, many of the staff members who were leading our unionization effort were more junior staff members who had not yet moved into budget management responsibilities at the organization. And so they didn't have as much visibility into the way our funding was structured and worked. And so I think there was a lot of time spent at the beginning really trying to build trust around the fact that we weren't holding back on the amount of discretion we had around spending, that we really were operating in a pretty prescribed financial environment. And that then enabled us, once we built trust around that and removed skepticism around that, to be able to move more effectively into talking about the issues that we really needed to discuss.
Interesting. So I'm hearing you say there's a lot of education that occurred, both for yourself and then education for those who were kind of leading this effort at the employee level.
Absolutely. And I think there's just so much that you need to think about it the moment that this happens, right? It is a brand new thing thrust upon your organization that you probably, unless you've worked in another unionized workspace, and the vast majority of people in our organization had not, you really don't even know what you're supposed to do. So I'll tell you how this came about in our organization. I mean, we were on a virtual staff meeting in December of 2020, the early stages of the pandemic, and a portion of our staff announced that they had an intention to unionize. And while we initially came together with some words that came together in that moment to indicate, our respect and support for their desire and our respect that they had brought this forward and brought this to us. I also remember saying, like, we need to take a pause and really talk to our council and figure out what our responsibilities are within this new framework, because it was a completely new framework that we had no experience with. And I think it's very important that you figure out what are those immediate steps, because there are some decisions that an organization has to make right away. And I think the most critical one, that I often talk to folks about, is how you're going to react to this request to unionize, because you need to make a decision very quickly about whether you are going to voluntarily recognize the union or whether you're going to wage a campaign of some sort, to be able to speak with your employees about why you think unionization might not be the best thing for your organization. And I think that is a critical decision. And I think it's one that, to my mind, presents both a unique challenge and opportunity in the nonprofit space that might be different than in a for profit space. Because I think in the nonprofit space, you really need to think about how your response to your employees expressing this desire is going to square with the values that you put out to the world, with the
Mm.
values that you profess internally to your own workforce about what you're about. And so for us, it was very clear from the outset that we were not going to do anything to oppose unionization in our workplace, that we felt like to do so would be antithetical to our value set and to how we present ourselves in the world and what we say we're about in the world. At the same time, we felt like we didn't have a lot of visibility into whether everyone who would be in the bargaining unit felt the same way. And we felt like we had an obligation to all staff members to hear their voices. And so we wanted to figure out if there was a way, short of waging some kind of campaign that could be perceived as oppositional, to do due diligence essentially on what our employee base was telling us. And so we learned of something called a card count. And we actually ended up engaging a retired city council person who both parties agreed would be a neutral party. And he simply did a card count. He went through all of the cards that folks who are in the bargaining unit sign to say, I would like to be part of a union. He compared that against the number of folks who would be eligible to be in the unit. And once we had a majority of folks say, yes, I would like to be part of this effort, we immediately recognized. And so I'm always really happy that we were able to pull that off in the middle of a pandemic and the holiday season,
Wow.
to be able to do it in about 2 weeks' time. And I really think, and this was validated by comments by our own union, that having that early support and that early recognition really was very validating to them. And I think put us in as good a position as we could be in entering into conversations.
That's a very thoughtful approach and great advice for someone who might be sitting in that seat for the future. Melissa, as I think about the way you described kind of your funding uh, sources being mostly government grants and things, what are some of the costs that nonprofit organizations can expect that are associated with contract negotiations or this entire process?
Yeah, I think there are two categories of costs, Allison. I mean, there are kind of the undeniable monetary costs, and then there are costs in terms of time and productivity that I think are also worth discussing just around capacity. So, with respect to monetary costs, certainly there are increased legal fees for this period. And I think there's the opportunity to determine like when you're going to engage legal counsel, when you might be able to engage a consultant to help to try to more strategically utilize counsel in a different way. But I think there's no denying that at some point you need leadership support of one sort or another, consulting and legal counsel support throughout this process. And I think to skimp on that would be penny wise, pound foolish, because it's a really critical investment in the organization long term. I think that with respect to the contract itself, you can certainly expect that salary and benefits are going to be a source of negotiation. I think, interestingly enough, though, and I think this is something that it's important for folks to understand, I don't think that is the primary driver for most nonprofit unionization. And I think that's something that's really interesting to people who are not used to hearing that nonprofits unionize at all. I'll have folks who will hear that we have been unionized and be very shocked, not understand what it really means, and also make an assumption that therefore we must have been paying terrible wages or had really non-competitive benefits.
Mhm.
And we know that isn't true. First of all, we work with Exude on benefits. We work with an independent compensation consultant. We always were checking to market, with where we were with respect to salary and benefits. And so certainly we were not paying rates that for-profit companies would be paying for those kinds of things, but we felt like we were very much within the market. And so while our organization spent time on those, I think the vast majority of time in bargaining was spent on other things. So I would say with respect to cost, yes, I think you can expect that there would be some increase in costs around salary minimums, and around your overall benefit package. Things like your contribution to healthcare coverage, things like the amount that you're going to be contributing to a 403B plan, things that you might be prioritizing for other things like um, education reimbursement or other types of incentives for folks to be staying or for folks to engage in professional development. But I think there is a lot of room in there to determine what's important to you and to prioritize and be able to bring forward the things that you feel most align with your mission that you're prepared to do. Because let's face it, you can't possibly say yes to everything that
Right.
is requested, even if you feel like you'd love to at some level. So I think there's this prioritization. With respect to the non-monetary pieces, I think it's really important to talk about the capacity that this will take of your leadership team. Um, I believe it's really important for the leadership team and for the CEO to stay engaged in this process. I know not all labor council feel that way or advise that. I feel like it was critically important for me, my head of HR, and my head of finance to be engaged with council and to be leading the discussions with our union, because I think it's possible to get to a contract and not have worked through underlying issues that may have precipitated some of the conversation and some of the proposals. And so you can get to that contract, you may then still have lots of lingering issues. And so we made the decision early on that I was going to take the lead in negotiations, that our HR VP and our head of finance, our COO, were going to be there leading that charge with me, that we were going to have counsel there as a backstop in our sessions, but we were going to engage in that relationship building. And so at the end of 2.5 years of negotiations, which is a pretty average period of time, that's about 2 to 3 for a first collective bargaining agreement, it took an extraordinary amount of time and effort, but we came through that from a place that started fraught to a place where we have a solid working relationship with our union and where all of us were mutually exuberant about getting to the ratification of the collective bargaining agreement. And I think that's because of the time we invested. And so I would just say that that means that you may need other capacity support for that leadership team if you're going to take that route and really make that investment, because it takes a lot of time. And I'd say the other productivity piece to keep in mind is just that a lot of what I think the unionization about right now is about things like decision making, seats at the table, having predictability around management styles, and making sure that a management experience is consistent across an organization, memorializing and really institutionalizing commitments around things like DEI. I also think it's about a rethinking of work generally and the role that work plays in people's lives and the amount of control that work has over people's lives. And so, one of the ways that plays out, I think, is in a request for more recognition around the need for work life balance. And
Mhm.
so that translates into additional requests for time off or different kinds of leave. And so I think that you need to be prepared for the fact that your workforce may need to adapt to times when productivity may shift for different teams, because other folks may be on leaves, or there may be additional times when you decide the workplace is closed, in order to address those kinds of concerns around overall staff well-being, which can hopefully lead to retention and a better experience for staff.
So that you've identified a couple of big potential changes to how work is done and perhaps how managers lead under a CBA. How do you prepare your managers to lead effectively under a collective bargaining agreement?
I think that's a great question, Allison. And I feel like it is one that was a lesson ongoing, even in my final year in the organization. But I'll tell you where we started. And we started with something that um I hope that organizations will do and would be happy to help talk more with folks about how to support, which is to get management engaged from the very beginning.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that is an adjustment when unionization happens in your workplace is that suddenly you go from being, I think in most cases, a full staff that has a few leadership segments to it, to a staff that has a demarcation line, down the middle of it, the folks who are in unit and the folks who are not. And the folks who are not are all called management, regardless of kind of where they fall in the hierarchy of the organization, regardless of how much seniority they have. In our case, everyone who was in management were the folks who were in supervisory positions or confidential managerial positions. And so they really ranged from folks who were brand new supervisors to folks who were in the executive team. And so suddenly we needed to create something called management team that subsumed all of those folks. And so what we decided is we wanted to really from the beginning give that group a meaningful purpose, which was to have a space where folks could talk about any kinds of challenges they might be encountering or any questions they had as we worked through it. But also, and really importantly, they were a sounding board for our thinking about counter proposals to proposals that the union was bringing to us. And so, whenever a proposal came up that we felt would have an impact on day to day management, we would take our counter proposal thinking to that management team and say, you're the closest to this issue. You're going to see the actual implementation. You're in the best position to tell us what are the unintended consequences that we might not be thinking of. How will this play out for you day to day? What kind of challenges or opportunities does it present? And so we did that throughout the course of our 2.5 years, so that at each stage, we were sharing with our management team what was being proposed, hearing their ideas back, and really hopefully then getting a little bit more of understanding about what was going to be happening in the long run. I also think, it's really important that your management team be engaged from the beginning because things really shift immediately. Your management team needs to be instructed on what it can and can't say to staff members they may have very close personal and working relationships with if folks come to them to talk about the unionization effort. There are rules in place for reasons, to protect undue influence on staff, to protect all around, but it could feel very unnatural, especially because I think in nonprofit workplaces, we're all coming with this idea that we're all working toward the same mission. People build close bonds over the work and personally, and it really does shift what those dialogues can be about in order to protect the whole process. And I think also, as soon as the unionization announcement is made and leading up until that time of ratification, which, as I said, could be years, you are in this space called status quo, which again is a brand new concept, I think, for most entities. They've never really had to do that. And what it means is you can't really move in any way from any of your current policies and practices without bouncing those up to the union to talk about because they could be subjects of negotiation. And so it's really important that your management team understands that if they're trying to figure out a situation or how to apply a policy, or if something new has come up or something that feels a little bit different, that they really use your HR team as a backstop to be able to test out those ideas, to talk them through, and to engage counsel as needed because there isn't that same degree of flexibility. You really want to make sure that you're adhering to status quo during this period so that you're following the rules that are set out for it. I was also going to say, I think it can be a time that there's a little bit of testing on all sides. Folks are trying to figure out what this new space looks like. It can be frustrating for managers that certain things are happening for the first time and that HR is advising we need to take this to council. And so things can take a bit longer than they usually do. And I think, it's just really important that folks understand why you're doing this, that this is a really important legal framework, that you want to set out on this relationship and out on these negotiations on the right foot. And so you want to be able to follow suit in every way that you need to.
So I'm hearing you say that engagement out of the gate uh, can really help managers develop an understanding and be prepared for whatever the end result is when the contract is finally formalized. And I also think it must be a wonderful learning opportunity for managers who perhaps have not had this experience before, which is probably the majority of managers in this space, to understand the frameworks that you're describing and just to understand and learn that whole negotiation process.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a lot of training that's required as a part of this. And certainly, once we got to the place of a full contract and then to ratification, there were presentations on the contract as a whole, which puts things in much more of a clear perspective than when you're looking at it piece by piece. And also trainings by certain areas that we thought might become important or have a more immediacy to them to managers day to day. And so there were trainings that rolled out too. I think one of the things that was most interesting to me was that while we had been presenting for some time as an organization our desire to move to trauma informed leadership and to really think about what that meant for our organization, to really be meeting people where they were, to try to be flexible, to try to really provide customized solutions to people based on what was happening in their lives. I think for a lot of our managers, it felt as though some of the proposals that we were putting forward and that they were seeing in this final collective bargaining agreement felt in conflict with that. Like
Mm,
suddenly they experienced these systems as very rigid and as very prescribed. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that the concept of psychological safety that's behind trauma informed leadership really is very positional, right? That from a leader standpoint, a manager standpoint, psychological safety might mean, and trauma informed leadership might mean I have the ability to customize a solution. I can be flexible because I know what this person is going through. I can make calls. I can use my own intuition or experience to adjust a solution to something. Whereas to a junior staff person, psychological safety means I don't want to be at the whim of any particular manager. I don't want to be subject to potential implicit bias in the way they make their decisions, to favoritism, to other kinds of things. And so I think there was a little bit of tension and unease in the beginning about this feels like counter to a lot of the things we were working toward, but really needing to talk about the fact that for the junior staff members who bring these kinds of concerns forward in unionization, psychological safety does often mean standardization and predictability. And so I think that was a piece of the learning too.
that's a very, very interesting observation, something I hadn't thought about, but that really makes a lot of sense. Melissa, you've shared incredible information. If you have to think about some of the key lessons learned through this process, what are some of those key lessons you could share with our listeners?
I think probably the most important thing is how much my attitude as a leader and as the lead of our management team mattered in this process. And I don't see that out of ego. I say it really out of responsibility. That yeah, on the one hand, you have to learn that you can't take everything personally. Recognize that there are these larger seismic changes that have happened in the world over the last several years that I think have really led to this increase in unionization in our space. Uh, COVID, remote work, a rethinking of work, social and racial reckonings of all sorts, people really rethinking what they want out of their lives, right? There are so many things that are huge and larger than any one of our organizations, and so you can't take every aspect personally. And yet, I think that you do need to be introspective and look within yourself and your own organization to say, what were some of the things that I knew were happening? What were some of the things where there were rumblings, there were clear examples, there were clear messages that something wasn't going the way that it might have been. And I think that can be challenging because, especially in a leadership position, you know that you might have been working on certain things. You know you might have been working towards certain solutions, the kinds of things that are not on full blast for the entire organization. And you also have to recognize that things don't necessarily happen at a pace that works for people. That people
Mhm.
can still feel harm and discomfort during a period when you're trying to work things out. And you need to be real about that and to really, I think concretely about things that you are open to acknowledging need to change within your organization. And I think if you can do all of those things, you then are in a spot where you can ground yourself. Check whatever your first reaction might be to a proposal. Like something might seem outrageous to you on first read. I think you need to feel that, feel whatever you're going to feel about it because you're a human being, but then ground yourself and get curious. Like as soon as I would just say to myself, approach with curiosity. And as soon as I made that mental switch, I was able to look at that initial proposal that didn't click for me, that I didn't understand why people were asking for what felt fairly extreme. And I was able to ask probing questions. Please tell me more about this. Like, did something occur that made you ask for this? Is there something that happened that this is trying to address? Can you tell me more about what you were thinking? Can you give me some examples
Mhm.
about the sorts of things that are at issue? And almost every time when our team was able to do that, some concrete, real thing surfaced that we could then understand better and craft a more tailored solution to that worked for both parties. And it allowed us to move so much more smoothly through the later stages of the negotiations. So I would just say, really allow yourself to feel whatever you're feeling, do the introspection that you need to as a leader and as a leadership team. Have safe spaces where you can say the things that you need, or where you can vent if you need to, where you can have space to let out the emotion that you might need to. But then really think about how you're going to ground yourself and represent your organization and its values in the sessions, and how you're going to approach with curiosity to really understand what's behind the proposals.
That's a really fascinating and appreciate that insight. If you have to leave our listeners with that best piece of advice, if they are sitting in the seat that you sat in going through this process, what is that best one or two pieces of advice?
Yeah, I would say to not stay in a place of panic or anger or betrayal, a feeling of betrayal, or any of the emotions that I have heard reflected by people I've spoken to, right?
Mhm.
I think you feel those feelings. People feel them because they're human and because they feel like they've been leading workplaces where they've been trying to do the right thing. They've been trying to be flexible. They've been trying to put benefits in place. They're all trying to work toward a really great mission to try to do something important in the world. And so this stuff doesn't feel great when it happens. And I think you need to acknowledge all of that and then figure out how you're going to move past that. And part of how you move past that is by quickly sizing up the situation and getting resources in place to help you and your team feel more in control of what's happening, and allow you to make that switch from "this is happening to me" to "how do I leverage this into an opportunity that can improve my organization." And so I would say that means thinking about whether you have labor counsel that you really trust and can lean on, whether there are other consultants you need to engage with who can help your leadership team move through this in a way that's reflective of your values and will ensure that you're leveraging this to accomplish a lot of your strategic goals and have your policies and practices line up with your mission and your values, and whether you have a communications partner online in the event that any of this goes in a direction that you need to really think about: how am I going to communicate with the outside world about what's happening? I think if you can get a team lined up that allows you to feel like you've got a little bit more of a sense of control in a situation where you might feel a little bit out of your depth, you'll be able to think more clearly and really approach the situation to reflect the value set that you want to in order to lead your organization through it.
Melissa Weiler Gerber, founder and principal of Collective Promise. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us at Exude Human Capital for sharing such incredible insights and your personal experience to help others be prepared to experience the same.
Thank
And
you.
for all of your listeners, our listeners out there, thank you for listening in to yet another Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. We hope to see you next time.